I was 10 years old when I first encountered death. Real lighthearted way to start this morning, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, I'd been to funerals, I'd been to visitations and things like that before I was 10, but they were always for people who were kind of outside of my usual circles. And when you're a kid, it's a little hard to feel lost for people that you barely know or people that you maybe didn't know at all. I remember my parents, at one point in time, they started letting me bring like sketch pads or a couple of action figures and stuff like that whenever we had to go to a funeral or visitation just to keep me from squirreling around. But up until the time I was 10, my viewpoint of a funeral home was it was a place I had to get all dressed up to go and be bored at. Because I just didn't know any better. But when I was 10 years old, the first person who was a part of my inner circle, the first person who was somebody that I knew and genuinely cared about and loved, passed away. In December of 1996, I lost my grandpa, Charlie. My grandpa was a really interesting fella. He had fought in World War II, something that I knew about him, but he never really talked about. He didn't want to go discussing it and that sort of thing. He had built the house that my grandma and him lived in just outside of Williamsburg, Kentucky, and he was a carpenter by trade, and I can't help but wonder if that's maybe one of the reasons why I connected so much with woodworking, was just that familial bond there. He was an avid hunter. He loved to go hunting, and because of that, they had this huge property that they had down in Williamsburg, Kentucky, and they had like 6 or 7 beagle dogs they kept pinned up in the backyard. And as a little kid, every time I was there to visit, there was nothing more fun than going out there and wrestling around with a bunch of dogs. That was a good time. But if there's one true passion my grandpa had in his life, it was fishing. Oh, that man loved to fish. He loved to be out on the lakes and the rivers, just going out and fishing. In fact, he loved fishing so much that when he built his property there, he actually installed a pond, a perfect rectangle of water that he kept stocked with fish that was just underneath the power lines that ran power to their house. And at 6 or 7 years old, I went out there one time with my fishing rod, and I cast a little too aggressively. And the fishing line got wrapped around the power lines. There's a fly right there. And they just kind of got stuck there. The fishing line was stuck around the power lines. In fact, the last time I was in Williamsburg, I drove by the old house, and sure enough, some 30 years later, there's still fishing line wrapped around that power line. Let it never be said, I did not make my mark. But my grandpa had a real bad pack or two a day habit. I think it's something he picked up during the war. That's never really been confirmed for me, but my grandpa was an avid smoker. It was just something that he did every single day. I remember his dashboard of his truck was just packed full of fresh cartons of cigarettes because you just never knew when you needed one. My grandma had been able to kick the habit well before I was born, but grandpa just never could. It was something that just stuck with him. If there can be a positive side to my grandpa having smoked that much, it gave him possibly the greatest laugh in human history. The only way I can describe it is it's kind of like a diesel engine trying to start cold. There'd be this wheeze until the laughter roared into life. I loved that sound. As a kid, that was a point of pride to be able to make my grandpa laugh, because then I got to hear that sound, and it's to the point that to this day, I can't smell cigarette smoke without having a little bit of that memory waking up in the back of my head. But as we all know, that particular habit doesn't lead to anything good. And my grandpa developed lung cancer. He was sick for a very long time. He was in the hospital for what felt like forever to me. And that may just be the perspective of a kid, because when you're a kid, time plays a little differently for you. But I remember that I had to spend weeks living with my grandparents here in Kokomo because I still had to go to school. And Mom and Dad were down in Lexington kind of trying to help Grandma along, or they'd go back to the house to kind of get things organized there for them. They missed Thanksgiving with us that year. I remember that. And it was just kind of a weird time in my life where it was just, I'm at Grandma and Grandpa's house. My grandpa's down in Kentucky laying in a hospital bed. Every now and again, my dad would come home for the weekend to just kind of get things organized or check the mail or all those sorts of things, and he might bring Blake and I down to go see our grandpa for what might be the last time. Until one day, we got the call that it wasn't the lung cancer that got Grandpa. He had developed blood clots in his legs. And those blood clots made their way to his heart. And my grandpa was gone. I was 100% convinced that my grandpa was going to get better. All the way leading up to it. That's what I believed. He had talked to me earlier, before he ever went to the hospital, about taking me on my very first fishing trip that summer. And I thought we were still going to make it. But the next time I saw my grandpa, he was in a box. It's been like 25 years, and I'm tearing up on it now. And I just knew I had been told I wasn't going to see Grandpa ever again. It took me months, to get past that point. It was something I knew, something I understood, but something I couldn't get past. I could be anywhere. I could be at home or at church or even at school, and it would hit me like a ton of bricks. I wouldn't be doing anything of any note or any particular importance or anything like that, and it would just cross my mind. I'm not going to see my grandpa again. And boom, tears. And when you're in 5th grade, the kid who cries all the time ain't exactly the most popular kid in your class. But I felt that loss of somebody important to me, of somebody I cared about. I was in mourning. All of us in this room, we know what mourning is like. It's something that every single one of us has to walk through in our lives. And mourning takes place in different ways and in varying degrees of severity. Mourning is not just when we lose somebody that we love. We mostly associate it with that because that's one of the most devastating parts of it. But mourning can take place in 100 other different ways. It can happen at the loss of a job, the loss of financial security. It can happen at the loss of a pet. It can happen at the loss of friends who have to move away from you. It can happen at the loss of a house that you loved when you moved away from it. It can even be mourning the loss of the way things used to be for you in your life. The only underlying commonality in mourning is that it is something that we experience when we experience the loss of someone or something that we genuinely care about. And please understand, if you're here and you've experienced the loss of some kind and you feel that sense of mourning over that loss, regardless as to what it is, that feeling is totally valid. The people around you may not get it. They may not understand why you feel so strongly about this, but it doesn't matter because you feel that pain of loss. It's something that's so hard for us. It's something that is so difficult for us to move past. And again, like last week, this is not a place that any one of us wants to be. We don't want to be in that position of feeling that sense of loss. We don't want to mourn in our lives because it is such a difficult thing for us to get past. And so if you found what Jesus told us last week to be questionable or maybe even a little irritating, well then today you might find it downright angering when Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 5 verse 4 that blessed are those who mourn. Nope. No, it was difficult enough for me last week to wrap my mind around the idea that I could be blessed in the midst of feeling like I'm broken. This almost feels like a step too far. Because no person at any point in time when they've ever been through a period of mourning in their life has ever felt like God's hand was on them. None of us in the midst of our own mourning have ever felt like this is a good thing for us because now we're blessed by God Himself, right? This almost feels like Jesus might just be a little detracted. And so we may ask ourselves this question, does Jesus really know what mourning is? I mean, we're talking about the literal Son of God here, A person who all throughout the Gospels we see heal the sick, make the blind be able to see, and yes, raise the dead. So how can he understand what mourning is like for us? How can he understand when somebody close to him dies and he can just wave his hand and everything's okay? Does Jesus understand what it means to mourn? And the short answer is yes. Yes, he does. In fact, in the story that we're going to be talking about today, we see Jesus encountering people who are in mourning, people who are mourning the loss of not just anybody, but actually a close friend of Jesus himself. We find this story in John chapter 11. So if you get your Bibles out or your phone out, something like that, meet me in John chapter 11. But if you're familiar with this story at all, you may wonder what this has to do with the notion of mourning, because we know how this story ends. But there's something in here that I think we need to look at, that we need to examine a little closer. So as you're turning to John chapter 11, let me back up a little bit, backtrack, because there's something that we need to understand and unpack. We need to remind ourselves of a couple of different things. See, Jesus' ministry has been going on for a little while at this point in time. And Jesus has become rather popular in this area. So popular that whenever he comes into town, everybody wants to come and see him. Everybody in that town wants to come and hear his teachings. They want to be around him. A lot of them hope to be healed by him, because that's something that he's also known for. He's really popular amongst the crowds of people. Not so much around the Pharisees and religious leaders. See, at this point in time, things have started to shift for him in that arena. But everywhere that Jesus has gone, he has encountered and changed the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of random strangers. And along the way, Jesus has also made some friends outside of the 12 disciples who followed him everywhere he went. One of these friends was a man by the name of Lazarus. Lazarus was the brother of Mary and Martha, two ladies who get a little bit more, I'll call it screen time in the Gospels. We see them a little bit more frequently than we do see Lazarus, but Lazarus was their brother, somebody that they cared very much about. Lazarus was not just a friend of Jesus, he was also a friend of the disciples as well. He was somebody who they all connected with. Somebody who they genuinely cared for, they'd spent time with. We don't know the full nature of their friendship. We don't get a whole lot of exposition on that sort of thing, but we know that it is somebody who Jesus genuinely cares about. And yet by the time we get to John chapter 11, things for Lazarus aren't going very well. Lazarus has gotten sick. And it doesn't seem like he's getting any better. In fact, it seems like the end may be near. And so Mary and Martha, the brothers of Lazarus, they send a message to Jesus. We see it in verse 3. It says, "So the sisters sent a message to him, 'Lord, the one you love is sick.'" Now, I don't know exactly what the motivation was behind sending this message, but I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that these ladies have probably seen with their own eyes, but at the very least heard that their buddy Jesus has healed a lot of sick people. And they probably have that thought, if Jesus is willing to do that for random strangers everywhere he encounters, surely he's going to drop everything and come and heal his friend, right? But that's not what Jesus does. In fact, Jesus' reaction to this whole thing is a little bit strange. We see it in verse 4. Jesus says, "This sickness will not end in death, but is for the glory of God." Jesus said some weird things. Can we agree on that? This sickness is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And instead of rushing off to go and be with his friend and to heal his friend who's sick, Jesus stays where he's at for 2 more days. He's heard that this friend that he cares about, a friend he cares about so very much that Mary and Martha didn't even need to say his actual name. They just referred to him as the one you love. I don't know if you've got a friend that you could refer to as the one you love. I do. Somebody who, once you say, "Hey, your little buddy," or "Hey, your friend over there," I know immediately who we're talking about. You don't need to say his name. And Jesus had that with Lazarus, to the point the sisters just referred to him as the one you love. And Jesus knew who we're talking about. In verse 5, John himself actually goes to mark at how much Jesus cared about Lazarus and about that friendship. So it's a strange thing that Jesus sits here for 2 more days after hearing his friend is sick, don't you think? If it was you or I and we found out a friend that we're so close with that you could refer to them as the one you love is sick, I'm dropping everything. I'm heading to Rushsylvania, Ohio. I'll go to Ohio for my friend. That's how much I care. Ohio. But Jesus stays put for a couple of days. 2 full days, in fact, before he ever moves. After those 2 days, Jesus says it's time for them to head back to the area of Judea. And there's something when Jesus says this that kind of triggers something in the back of the disciples' mind. See, they're not real excited to go back to Judea, even though that's where Bethany is and that's where Lazarus lives. See, because the last time that they were in Judea, you remember how I said Jesus was popular amongst the crowds, not so much the Pharisees and religious leaders? Well, the last time they were in the area of Judea, some Pharisees and religious leaders tried to stone Jesus to death. A minor inconvenience. And the disciples themselves, they're not real thrilled to go back to that area. They're not really enthusiastic to head back to a place where their lives may be at risk, even though their friend is sick. But Jesus tells the disciples, well, Lazarus is asleep and I need to go wake him up. And the disciples, they don't get it. They're like, well, if Lazarus is asleep, that's a good thing, right? He's going to sleep, he's going to get better, we don't die, everybody wins. They weren't really good at subtlety. So Jesus has to put it bluntly to them, be a little bit more poignant. And in fact, John himself, the author of this book, was one of the 12 disciples that was there, and he's willing to point out just how much they didn't get it in verses 14 and 15. He says, so Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there so that you may believe, but let's go to him. He had to be direct with them, to say it plainly that Lazarus has died. And even though this has no bearing on the rest of the narrative, I kind of want to point out what verse 16 says, because I think it's funny. Thomas says, let's go too so that we may die with him. What a ray of sunshine Thomas was. We don't have too many encounters with Thomas, but he seems like such a chipper dude. When they finally make it to Bethany, and this is a journey that doesn't just take a couple of hours, this is a journey that takes a couple of days. So they're already a couple of days behind, and they stayed where they were at for 2 more days. By the time they get there, they hear that Jesus was right. That Lazarus has died. And in fact, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. 4 days where Jesus was not there. 4 days where Jesus could have come beforehand if he'd just taken the heads up ahead of time. 4 days, Lazarus is dead. When they finally make their way to their house, they don't just see Mary and Martha there, they see a whole crowd of people. It's a logical assumption to make that Lazarus was likely in his early to mid-30s, probably fairly close in age to Jesus himself. And so seemingly half the town is here with Mary and Martha crying alongside the loss of this young man. Somebody who was a part of their community, somebody who they all knew, somebody who they all understand, and they're there mourning with them. And when Martha hears that Jesus is finally in town, albeit too late, she goes off to greet him. And the way that Martha greets him is something that I think I can feel what she's feeling in that moment. We see it in verses 21 and 22. She says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Yet even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. She's seen Jesus do some incredible things. She's aware of who it is that she's talking to in this moment. She knows that he can do these things again. But she also knows that if Jesus would have been here in the first place, this never would have happened. That Jesus could have handled this situation before it reached this point. There's There's that faith in what she says and trusting that Jesus can make the situation right, but there's also just that tinge of anger. This weird blending of faith and anger, of irritation and trust. It's a place that I think I've been before. I'm guessing some of you in this room have probably been there as well. A place that knows that God has a bigger plan that we can't see, that God is all-powerful, that He can do all things. And yet also that anger when we feel that loss. When we know that God could have done something about it. But if you've never been in that spot, I'm going to guess that you likely have been where Mary was. See, Mary doesn't feel the same confliction in her spirit that Martha does. No. Mary has one reaction for Jesus. We see it in verse 32. It says, as soon as Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and told him, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. There's no hope in what she says. She doesn't follow that up with, but I still think you're a great guy. No, she's angry because she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that if Jesus had shown up, that he could have handled this situation. Most every other time we've seen Jesus perform a resurrection, those resurrections are almost immediately after or shortly after the person has died. Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. At that point, decomposition is starting to take effect because they don't have the same preservation methods that we do today. Jesus could have saved my brother. But he didn't. He could have spared me from this pain. But he chose not to. It's after this encounter with Mary that Jesus seems to have a change. See, up till now in this narrative, we've seen Jesus kind of act one particular way. He's Jesus. We know how he acts. And yet, as he looks at Mary and Martha grieving for their brother, as he looks at these other folks in this town grieving for the loss of their friend and neighbor, Jesus has a shift in his heart. We see it in verse 33. It's the first one that shows us a way that Jesus has shifted in the way he's carried himself through this narrative. It says, when Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come with her crying, he was deeply moved in his spirit, and we can't miss these last two words, and troubled. Jesus himself was troubled at their reaction to this. He himself was starting to experience a bit of an emotional situation. And as they make their way to the tomb where Lazarus is being held, where his body has been placed, John 11, verse 35 happens. It's such a small verse. In fact, it's the smallest verse in all of Scripture. It's the easiest one to memorize. So if you want to leave this place today and say, I memorized a verse of Scripture today, you can say that. It's just 2 words. I mean, you should be able to memorize it. But it's one of those that's in the course of this narrative, and especially what happens after this verse. It's so easy for us to overlook it. For us to just move past it and keep going because we know what's going to take place next. But John 11, verse 35 says, Jesus wept. Up till now, Jesus has kind of kept a straight face, right? He's been consistent in the way that he acts, and yet in the midst of this moment, as he's surrounded by people who are mourning, who are grieving, he weeps. Now, weeping is not just getting choked up. It's not just squeezing out a couple of tears for dramatic effect. Weeping is that uncontrollable, ugly crying. That crying that makes you want to just run to your room and shut the door and shut yourself out from the rest of the world. The crying that you don't want to see anybody see you do. In the midst of this mourning, in the midst of this pain of loss, Jesus wept. Why? See, beforehand, Jesus already knew about Lazarus' death. He'd known about it for days. well before they ever made their way to Bethany. He told the disciples when they were getting ready to leave, Lazarus is dead. So he knew this. And so it stands to reason that Jesus knew what he was going to do next. In fact, he's alluded to that since the moment he found out Lazarus was sick. He said this was going to happen for the glory of God. And we know the rest of the story. We know what happens next. So why does Jesus weep? If he knows that in a moment he's about to take their mourning and their grieving and their sense of loss, and he's going to change it into laughter and dancing and joy, why does he weep? See, I don't think that Jesus is mourning the loss of Lazarus. I don't think that's what's happening here. In fact, I think Jesus is crying out of his compassion for the people that are around him. He's encountered this whole group of people who are mourning and grieving. So Jesus joins in on that. He sees their pain. He knows he's about to take that pain away. He knows he's about to do something that they're going to be talking about for thousands of years afterwards. But he doesn't delight in that pain. He sees this group of people who are mourning this loss, who are grieving and feeling this deep in their bones. These people who've lost their neighbor and friend, these sisters who've lost their brother. And instead of getting upset and telling them to move on and telling them to get over it, he cries with them. He cries with them. Isn't that a comforting thought? To know that Jesus mourns with us. To know that when we feel that pain of loss, when something or someone that we love or that we care about has been taken away from us, that Jesus not only knows about it, but he empathizes with us. To know that there's not a tear that's been shed that Jesus did not know about and feel alongside. In that moment, Jesus was surrounded by people mourning the loss of Lazarus, and his compassion for them allowed him to join in that crying with them. How comforting do you think that Mary and Martha found the tears of Jesus? To know that the pain that they felt was valid. To know that it was real and that Jesus took it seriously. It had to be a moment that filled them with some semblance of comfort. Yeah, it didn't bring their brother back, at least not yet. But to know this person who they looked up to, this person they cared about, that they viewed as a teacher, that they probably felt was the Messiah, the Son of God, mourned alongside them. It had to bring some semblance of comfort to them. See, Jesus doesn't tell us that we're blessed in the midst of mourning because he wants us to get over our loss, to move on from it. That's not Jesus' style. Instead, he tells us that we're blessed when we're mourned because we'll be comforted. We'll be comforted by the people that come alongside of us, the people who empathize with our pain, who throw their arms around us and just let us cry. We'll be comforted by the people who've walked down the paths that we've walked before, or at least had a similar journey to ours, who know a little bit at least of what we're going through. Those are the people that can bring comfort to us. Jesus tells us that we'll be blessed because we'll be comforted, and we can be comforted in the knowledge that our Lord and our Savior knows and sees our pain. And if Jesus sees the pain of those in loss, then so must his church. Church, understand we are called to be the people of compassion. We are called to be people who throw our arms around those in mourning, those who are grieving, those who have felt a loss. We may not understand it, we may not know what they're feeling, but we still got to be there for them. We're called to be the people who just come alongside them, to just listen to them as they tell their story about that person or about that thing or about whatever it was. We're called to cry alongside of them. We have this tendency, and I'm so guilty of this. I I do this literally every single funeral I've been at or led even. We feel like we have to find the right words to say, just something to say in that moment that's going to bring them some comfort, something to vocalize the way that they feel. Can I tell you? That's junk. Because the words that you say don't matter near as much as the fact that you were there. Sometimes, the most comforting thing that we can do with somebody who's feeling that loss, who's in the midst of that mourning, sometimes the most comforting thing we can do is just sit beside them and cry with them. Because that's what Jesus would do. Because that's what he did here. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted.